Are we coast to coast? Taylor, are you on the East Coast still?
Yeah, North
Look
Carolina.
at us.
That one.
Continental
And then
webinar.
three people right in the middle,
Yeah.
the heartland of America.
All right, I'll log off and see if this works real quick.
I believe in it. Lord, make it happen.
Unleash
These
your Pentecostal
Pentecostals.
power.
Yeah.
Pentecostals should make it happen.
Name it, claim it, Brenton.
I want to see a flame over his head when he logs back in.
To everyone joining us tonight, I hope you're enjoying the bantering so far. The banter is always the best part.
Hurry, Nika and Scott, if you have any harsh criticisms of Brenton's chapter, now's your time.
None. None. It was a pleasure to read. The only criticism I have of anybody is when I had to add extra doodads into the manuscript. So he gets a point deduction for having a photo, the only photo in the whole book.
I know this is always a challenge with publishers.
I had to get permissions. I had to name it. It took
Yeah,
at least
yeah.
3 extra emails. Can you believe how much work that takes? I did learn though, as long as you have permission for the photo, what was in the photo, the Mamertine prison, we didn't have to get permission from them. I thought that was interesting. I don't really understand all the copyright rules, but I learned a lot in this. Oh, bummer.
That is weird. That's the one that
Brenton,
worked
one
for
name
me.
is easy to remember. People can remember your Brenton.
It's all good. It's all good.
Okay.
Well, Kelly, should we get started officially? Past the
Let us
banter?
get started. Let us get started.
Okay.
Yes, fantastic. Taylor,
Yeah,
lead us through.
I'll lead us through. I feel like we should stop and pray, but I guess that's not what these things kind of do, I guess. But good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the webinar. And it's on this recent book that we've written together, and Upon This Rock. And there's a really good subtitle to it. Peter's Transformative Journey from Fisherman to Follower to Foundational Leader. I will give a shout out to Alice McQuitty for really putting her thumbprint on that title. But it's a work edited by Scot McKnight and Dr. Nika Spaulding, right?
As of a week ago, yeah.
There you go.
Forever and always Dr. Aunt Nika. So,
Yep. And then there's some various essays by members of our cohort. We're joined by Brenton Fessler as well. He was a contributor. And myself, and then Kelly as well, contributed a chapter, and she's helping host us. But Scott is the author of over 90 titles if he hasn't written a book this week, right? Scott.
Nothing this week, but
He's an esteemed New Testament scholar, professor, our friend, our fearless leader. But Scott, let's have you kick us off and talk about why Peter. Why did we do a book on Peter? I mean, aren't we Protestants, right? Aren't we supposed to be Paul people? And if you really think about Peter's life, it seems most of the top of mind stories are more embarrassing than exemplary, right? So why Peter? Why are we talking about Peter?
Well, that's what Lynn wrote. Lynn kind of displayed this whole story in her foreword to the book, is that she was a Paul person and she has fallen in love with Peter. I mean, there's several reasons, and I'm glad to be joined today by Pentecostal Brenton and the political Taylor and the promenading Nika.
Wow.
I didn't come up with a P for Kelly's chapter. So, but we're talking about Peter. And I began as an academic teaching, even before I was still a master's student, teaching First Peter exegesis at a seminary. And I really like First Peter. And so I've always had a little bit of a concern for why we don't talk about Peter. And I wrote a book for lectures at a Nazarene seminary. I want to say it's in Kansas City, but I'm really not sure now where it was, called Pastor Paul. And when I was writing that, I thought, now somebody needs to write about Peter the same way. And this is why. Paul, we have all these letters, and we have theological perceptions of pastoral ministry that show up especially in Second Corinthians and some in First Corinthians, but then he writes his pastoral letters that are like from a senior leader to a junior leader. So we have lots of reflection on Paul as a pastor. And I think, to use another P, as Protestants, I think we have neglected Peter. And I think we've neglected Peter because the Catholics don't. And yet, here we have a man whose story of following Jesus is known in ways that Paul's is not. We have candid reflections about him by other people. We have almost nothing about Paul by others. I mean, the book of Acts talks about Paul, but doesn't reflect on him so much as a person. But Peter shoots, pokes an elbow into his ribs, if not more, in Second Peter. So I just thought there's so much about Peter's life that has pastoral implications because he's learning to follow Jesus in the earliest group of followers alongside Mary, who's also neglected. I haven't thought of a Pastor Mary book, but that's not a bad idea. Nika can figure that out.
Yeah, here we go.
There is so much about his life, his failures as a follower of Jesus, that resonate with most Christians, even if they don't admit it. We have 2 letters ascribed to Peter, and we have an explicit reflection on pastoring in 1 Peter chapter 5 that makes him a good candidate. And, in our cohorts, we tried to write a book together in each of those cohorts. And the goal was to have everybody contribute in their own way and have segmented chapters that weren't, sort of like a cohesive book. But of all the books that we've done together as a cohort, I think this is the most coherent and cohesive book when it comes to a focus that really stays sharp on a person so that there's continuity between chapters. And just in case the listeners haven't paid attention to this book, there's a marvelous personal reflection by Noah Schumacher. And then Alice looks at Peter's denials, Alice McQuitty. And of course, since she's not here, we can talk about her, even though she's listening, is that we all loved her chapter when she was presenting in class. And then Matt Van Winkle wrote on conversion. Nika wrote on Peter's attempt to walk on the water, or did he walk on the water? And she cleverly called it Peter's Promenade. And Brendan Lang wrote on the Great Confession. And just one chapter after another, Brenton wrote on, I don't want to take fire from him, but he taught us how to speak in tongues by learning to say woulda, coulda, shoulda, bought a Honda. And if you say that enough time, evidently you get the gift of the Spirit.
That's right.
And Kelly wrote on transformative events in Peter's life in the early church. And there was just so many good chapters. And Taylor wrote something on reimagining politics. And he's been thinking about this, the Christian in politics, way too much.
Yeah.
And
Amen.
as a result, it showed up in a really fine chapter in the study. So it was just really fun to work on this. And I would like to ask each of our people in the room tonight, what do you call these things, rooms? Each of the rooms to describe why. Okay, now that's how I answered your question of why Peter. Is that fair enough,
I
Taylor?
think so. I think so.
And why they chose the chapter they did and what they learned about, let's say, Peter and the pastoral life. And we'll begin with Nika. So
Yeah, this is an honest to goodness story that Scott can actually confirm. When our very first semester in Scott's DMin cohort, he mentioned that his master's thesis was on Peter walking on water. So when he pitched the book, I picked that topic so that I could read his master's thesis and then pretty much have like you know, a guide to how I should write my chapter. Turns out he doesn't allow people to read his master's thesis. So my whole plan,
there's only 2 copies in the world.
they're locked up in his house. I could not find a key to his home and was not invited in. So I was forced to do my own research. So truly, when I found out I was going to be editing the book, I thought to myself, why don't I take the easy way out so that I can spend extra energy on my chapter? So that is honestly why I picked it. What's really sweet about it, though, is it felt like the Lord was providentially nudging me toward that chapter, even though I had to do my own research. And that's because the chapter ended up aligning with my own season of sort of getting out of my own metaphorical boat and having to learn to trust the Lord to walk on water in my own personal life. I stepped out of 15 years of pastoral ministry this past year while simultaneously writing this chapter. And so a chapter that talks about Peter needing to focus on Jesus, Peter doing the right thing and getting out of the boat. That's a big topic of conversation with scholars, whether or not he was foolish to get out of the boat at all. But when Jesus says, follow me, he doesn't really give us boundaries to where that following goes. And so I, with Peter, got out of my own boat. In fact, I created a Spotify playlist called Get Out of the Boat with worship songs that encourage me to trust the Lord. So I think for me, the chapter for me was a reminder that while getting out of the boat and walking on water is not common sense, I write in the chapter, following Jesus is not common, and hardly he made sense to Peter. And yet there was a real invitation to join with Jesus in this dominion over chaos and death, which is what water is seen as in the ancient world. And so it was a really powerful personal reflection for me. And so if you read the chapter, I think you'll be encouraged by Peter's faith, even in the midst of his failure, and that the very sure hand of God that reaches down and saves us, that saves Peter in that moment, is still the very sure hand of God saving all of us today. And so I tried to take the easy way out, guys, and ended up just in the deep water with Peter and Jesus. So
Very good. Taylor, since
Which
this
one?
is
Yeah. That's good.
Taylor Terzek on the East Coast.
Yeah.
Taylor chose a very difficult topic in our world today because as a pastor, he knows this is a very difficult topic to talk about, and yet it's so important. And I think it illustrates, I think your chapter is a beautiful illustration of what pastors need to do to talk about politics, theopolitics, theopolitical discipleship. But pastors are afraid to because they lose their job if they suggest that they lean toward a different candidate than some of the people in the church. So Taylor, enlighten us on how Peter can help churches pastorally to become theopolitical disciples in a way that reflects the way of Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right, Scott. It's weird how I've kind of tended towards this topic because it is so explosive. I mean, it's a tough topic to have in church settings, but I'm drawn to those types of topics, and I like bringing those conversations to congregations. So that's probably why I chose the topic, but also practically, I was writing my thesis on politics, and it was kind of a way to double dip. But yeah, as we look at scripture for reframing how we think about politics or framing how we think about politics, I think it's important to kind of give ourselves a baseline of how to approach scripture. Because when we go to the Bible to look at anything to do with politics, we have to recognize that they're dealing with a different political context than we are. So that was one of the things I started off in the chapters talking about how we have to put First Peter in the context of the letter when it was written and where it was written. So I talk about that. I mean, my chapter is wordy and long-winded. I'll be honest. There's a lot of things I threw at the wall. But so there's a lot of things that I think we need to pull out. But probably the big thing, and I'll say this, the big thing that I noticed with Peter, and I also noticed it with Paul, was that Peter gave a narrative or a storied theological worldview for his recipients to find themselves characterized into a new story. And that was kind of this big thing that I saw Peter doing. He gives them this storied gospel vision to guide their behavior. And it's the story of Jesus the Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at God's right hand, end of 1 Peter 3. He's the supreme Lord. He's the supreme chief imperator. Like, he is the King of Kings, Lord of Lords. So he gives them a supreme political story to find their political behavior grounded in. And so what I think Peter showcases for pastors today is that talking about politics in our congregation means talking about the political gospel and letting that be supreme in our imaginations in terms of what story we see ourselves living into. And I think that was the big kind of takeaway from me in First Peter.
It's great.
Okay, I'm not going to let Taylor get by with that answer, because Taylor wrote his master's thesis or his doctoral thesis on this very topic as well. So I'm going to push for you to clarify how the gospel helped shape Peter's understanding of political discipleship.
How the gospel shaped his understanding.
So in other words, what you write about Peter here is a reflection of what your thesis was all about.
Right. Right. And I think if you take a few steps back and you say, okay, what do Christians have to say about politics? The first and most important thing we have to say about politics is that we're a good news people that is a political story. That the good news of Jesus is a political event that shapes everything we should think about politics. And then the trickle down from that is that the church is the political body that we're most concerned about. So when Peter's writing this letter to a people suffering from being estranged and marginalized, he reminds them that they don't belong in this world, that they don't politically fit in the world that they're in, but they do politically fit with the gospel of Jesus. And that's where all of their politics then flows as a community that practices doing good for one another, pressing on through suffering. The story of Jesus is to become their story as a community. And so I think that's kind of Peter's scheme throughout the letter.
Okay. I wrote a chapter in the book on Peter, and one of my emphases was the importance of conversion, and let's just say ongoing conversion in the life of a pastor. Is that by the time Peter writes this letter, he's a transformed person that is banking off of all the experiences he had with Jesus in his growing into faith. I mean, you gotta get real and think about, what is it like to be a fisherman on the north side of the Sea of Galilee, where you run a lot of your business through the fish sauce created in Magdala, and selling fish in the open market as soon as you come in, and having all your family involved in mending nets and buying weights for your nets and negotiating with other people and making deals for the fish that you're going to catch. Peter comes to the conviction that this Jesus from Nazareth is the Messiah. And, the Gospels tell us, this was Brenton Lang's chapter, that Peter's confession lacked the substance that Jesus wanted it to have. But by the time Peter writes First Peter, he understands the cruciform gospel that gives rise to a cruciform understanding of life and a cruciform form of pastoring. And so there's the story of this person is involved in all of this. And for me, that was the fun of this. I had never lectured on Peter as a pastor, though I did give a sermon that reflected this, and we published that. It was for Laura Taro's church. And so I think that all the papers to me were contributing to this understanding of his life. So Brenton,
Yes.
I'd like you to talk about how Peter was truly a Pentecostal, a charismatic, and that this experience that he had shaped his ministry and made him a different person. Is that fair?
Yeah, no, that's good. And I would say even your earlier comment about how by the time he gets to this letter of First Peter, it's built upon the experiences he's had, but it's also because he's finally a Pentecostal. So
We
You
only
were
heard this coming.
you were
Finally.
almost a dispensationalist because you were just raptured about 10 minutes
I
ago.
know, I
So,
know.
it's in flux.
There's like a weird power surge that kicked our whole internet off. Is weird. So apologize about that. Um, yeah, actually, the choice of the chapter and the topic at hand for me was mainly because I didn't want Noah to have it.
Amen.
And so he is not a card carrying member of a Pentecostal denomination, and he wasn't in class in person. And if he's watching right now, Noah, you remember the moment you were joining via Zoom and we were doling out the topics. And I said, there's no way that you can have this topic. I actually have a card from Springfield, the home office of the Assemblies of God, that tells me that I'm a Pentecostal minister. And so I'm going to take this chapter. But it was actually more personal that for me, because so much of my theological training has been in the environments of being exposed to people who are not Assemblies of God or Pentecostal at times, and trying to wrestle and reconcile my own faith and foundation of belief, but knowing that we often lean upon the Peter story from Acts chapter 2 as our bedrock, right? That's the moment for
Mm.
so many people of the Pentecostal experience from that storyline. And I just wanted to make sure I knew why I was a Pentecostal. So I figured, why not deep dive into some of Peter's life and story as well?
Kelly, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Kelly looked at early chapters in the book of Acts where Peter is on full display as a charismatic, Pentecostal, apostolic agent of Jesus and the gospel in the Jewish and eventually in the Gentile world. So she had a narrative approach that really stimulated class discussion. So Kelly, share with us your heart that you learned about Peter.
Well, I remember the moment when the sign up went around for the topics as well in class, because that is the moment where I learned how if you have a Mac, how it's attached and it's integrated into every other device that you have. Because I think the poll went out and everybody else got their topic. And I was like, I don't know how y'all did this quickly. And it's because I'm on a Windows and not everything is attached and
Is
linked in
that
that
right?
same way. Yeah. And I was like, wait, how in the world did you do this? And so that is the moment when I learned the beauty of a Mac. So there was that, but it's true. But I was looking at the events in Peter's life about his about him being in conflict with the religious authorities. So that's where it started. Where is Peter with religious authorities in those early days after Pentecost? But what I noticed was as I kept reading the sections about Peter with the authorities, and I realized what pages I was flicking back and forth from, is that I was putting together different episodes of Peter's life in the early church, but they were punctuated by other stories that are complicated. For example, about Ananias and Sapphira and about them giving, and one of them is struck dead because they lied, and some difficult things to understand, right? It's a really kind of a bizarre little passage, that one is. But it's also punctuated, this time period for Peter is also interrupted by the church gathering together and praying and then being sent out again. So just as I read the events between Pentecost and the stoning of Stephen, I started seeing a rhythm of what was developing in the church under Peter's leadership and the apostles' leadership. And that is what they were doing on the outside of the church community and how that was inviting hostilities by the religious authorities, but then how they gathered as a church themselves and grew in discipleship, and then they went back out. And so it was a rhythm of this public private church life that I started to look at when I saw Peter.
Very good. I'm going to ask each of you to reflect on, in a sense, this sort of question. What have you learned about Peter that you wish you had known earlier, in your pastoral ministry, especially? But one of the things that really impressed me about Peter was that he was a witness. That he witnessed, of course, we know he tells the story about the transfiguration in Second Peter. And of course, there's debate about authorship. But he considered himself a co-witness of Jesus Christ. And a witness is someone who has an experience of Jesus and can tell that story. Now, there are some people who want to contend that a witness is just done, let's say, in an embodied way. But the Greek term, the Greek word, the verb martyreo and martyria, witness, and martus, witness, pertain to someone speaking what they have experienced. There's an integrity about what they have to say. To be a witness as a pastor is to be able to bring your own story to bear, your own story with Jesus, your own story with the church, with the gospel, with forgiveness, with justification, with following Jesus, with failure, into play in the pastoral ministry.
Mm-hmm.
And Peter was a witness in a full orb sense, that he knew the whole story of Jesus, unlike anybody, even Mary. Mary's hanging out in Nazareth with those kids, and Jesus is up in Capernaum, and Peter's with him all the time, watching all these miracles. And Peter becomes a co-witness of the gospel about Jesus Christ in a way that no one else could be. And it's not lost on all of us who pay attention to these things, that in the early church, they thought Peter was behind the Gospel of Mark, which then turns the Gospel of Mark. I remember learning as a seminary student that C.E.B. Cranfield, in his famous commentary from Cambridge University Press on Mark, had learned to convert it all into first person, that this was the story that Peter was telling. And it's that I've never forgotten about that. And I've played with this at times myself, but I'm not convinced that's the best way to study Mark. But Peter had story after story to tell about Jesus. And I think it behooves us to become witnesses in our ministry. Okay, who would like to go next?
Yeah, when I was in seminary in my master's program, I remember somebody sent me a BuzzFeed article that was like, you're supposed to take this quiz and figure out which disciple you were. And I took it and I got Peter, and I didn't want Peter. So I took it again and changed my answers until I got John, the beloved. And then I sent that result to my friend, and she said, nice try. And she knew like there was no way. And even me going first right now, I did that strategically. Because I find that I am Peter. Like, he's often the spokesperson. He speaks up quickly, doesn't always think before he speaks. On the day of the resurrection, John beats him there, but then Peter just runs headlong right into the tomb. I mean, and if Mark is, his witness, he's not shying away from the mistakes that he makes. And when he makes them, he makes them boldly. And
He's all in.
yeah. And in a lot of ways, I'm like that. And I think that's why this project was so deeply encouraging for me, because as the editor, as I'm reading all of this sort of, we put some strategically more pastoral chapters in the beginning, but then we sort of move chronologically through Peter's life. And by the time you get to the scene where he's being restored on the Sea of Galilee, the threefold, I do love you, Lord, after his threefold denial. And then you see him in Acts, like Kelly's talking about. I'm just so proud of him. You watch him grow up in the Lord. And I think because I have such an affinity, maybe I'm like Peter a little too much in the bad ways. My hope is I could aspire to be like him in the good ways. I think he's a really beautiful model for pastoral leadership, that he tells on himself when he's done things that were maybe foolish or wrong even. And yet he continues and he leads in the early church and he leads boldly and he leads the charge with Cornelius and he puts his reputation on the line. And if we're to believe Paul later, Peter also makes mistakes down the road. But by the time you get to his letters, you meet this mature fisherman who's been radically changed by an encounter with Jesus. And he is every bit as pastoral as we see in Paul. And I think for me, the way that this book impacted me is I want to keep growing up in the Lord. And so I'm able to follow Peter as a model for that throughout his stories and his letters. So maybe
Very
I'll
good.
learn to not always speak first, but maybe not. We'll see.
Yeah, I'll speak up second then, I guess. Kind of piggybacking on both of those. I think, in one sense, something that kind of clicked for me when we were going through Peter, especially because I spent most of my time in First Peter, was how much you can see Peter seemingly having learned lessons from his life and then using that to teach other people through his letter. So Kelly wrote the chapter where Peter gets in trouble for doing good, for healing this man, and then he has to go and present himself. He gets presented through the authorities and he gets in trouble, and he's like, "Why are you persecuting us? We're doing good." And then it's
Yeah.
like in First Peter, you see him commend the readers of his letter to continue to do good, even though the authorities might not consider it good. Or Peter was a guy of failure who kind of had the devil prowling around him at all times. He could fall at any moment, and that's how he instructs his followers later in First Peter. Like, hey, you can fall at any moment. The devil is prowling around. Like, be aware. So to see that dynamic, to see how much Peter spoke from his lived experiences, his own failures, that was something that clicked for me.
It's really good. I love this conversation, and I think that question about how has my perspective of Peter changed? Um, so there's a new it's not even a documentary, it's a new show available on some streaming service about Bono, and he's reflecting on his life as the lead singer of U2, world famous band, especially for my generation. My kids don't even know who U2 is, so that's really fun to feel really old. Um, but he tells this story in an interview about the new online streaming video that you can watch about coming into contact with Frank Sinatra many years ago. And Frank has this story where when he sings the song My Way in his early part of his career, it's boisterous and proud. But when he sings the song My Way later on in his career, when he's much older, it's a bit of an apology.
Hmm.
And I love the juxtaposition for each one of us as we travel through life, because there are things that we have learned along the way of following Jesus faithfully. And I bet the same is true for Peter, where for him, I don't know if he continues to be the person who has his foot in his mouth all the time later on, and he reflects a little bit differently. But for me, so much of the chapter that I wrote comes out of my own lived experience within a Pentecostal background and denomination. Peter could and probably would pass our test as a Pentecostal. Um, I I hate that this could possibly be sound bitten and put out there, but I don't know if Jesus could, because we don't have evidence that Jesus spoke in tongues. But that's what we do for Peter, right? Like, Peter's our guy, and he has this experience. But for my youth and my growing up years, being a Pentecostal was only about speaking in tongues. And I think for me, what I saw through this chapter writing experience was that there's so much more depth to Peter. It wasn't just about that one singular thing that happened in the upper room in Acts chapter 2. There's so many other moments where he is empowered by the Spirit to do good ministry and to do continually be that witness, that just that example of someone who's reflecting Jesus. So,
Very
yeah.
good. Kelly?
We've gotten a couple of questions so far.
Okay.
So let me throw out to you listener questions.
All right.
All right. From Jim, I'm always struck by Peter's role in Jesus's transfiguration. I'm not sure how deep you have dived into this part of Peter's journey, but how have you approached this and applied it to pastoral leadership?
Nika, do you want to
Yeah.
summarize what Elijah?
Yeah, Elijah's chapter I thought was really great in the Transfiguration because he really focuses on what Peter is thinking in that moment. And so, from Peter's perspective, he's got these two men, Moses and Elijah, standing on this mountain. And though Elijah's ending, he's taken up, right? Elisha's there. We do know Moses dies. And so, from Peter's perspective, he's standing there with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. And here are these two men who have died and now they are very much alive standing on this mountain with Jesus. And so Elijah named his chapter Death Defying Hope. And as someone who is ministering in a context that's more dangerous than many of us are, Elijah was really moved by this picture of Peter recognizing that if I continue to follow this Jesus, this new Moses, this better Elijah, there will be a death waiting for me. And of course, we know what Peter's experience will be like as he faces persecution from the Roman leaders. Taylor can write all about that from his political perspective. But Elijah is saying, from Peter's perspective, standing on that mountain, that was a moment that Peter can go back to and provide for him a well of hope as he faces persecution, as he faces his life limiting end of what his ministry is going to look like. And so the Transfiguration from Peter's perspective is a really beautiful chapter. I think Elijah handled it really beautifully, and it was one of my favorite ones. As a copy editor, I will tell you, he needs to learn how to use M dashes instead of N dashes. But other than that, I have no critiques of it. No, I'm just kidding. It was a fantastic chapter.
I will say with Elijah's chapter, it has my favorite footnote in the book
Which was?
because there's a footnote where he clarifies that the Transfiguration is actually a story about Jesus, but he's talking about Peter.
Yeah.
Remember that, Scott?
Yeah.
He covered his bases there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A story all about Jesus. And he's like, but let's talk about it from Peter's perspective. But I just want to make sure you all know, I do realize this is about Jesus, but it is I think it's it's a fantastic chapter in the book, and he handles it really beautifully from Peter's perspective.
And he chose the Transfiguration. It wasn't imposed upon him. At the same time, I think that this death-defying hope that shows up with Peter and his robust belief in resurrection is shaped by that experience in ways. And pastorally, I'm not at a lot of funerals. I don't know that the Transfiguration story is used in funerals. You three probably are in more funerals, or you four are in more funeral settings than I am. But I do think that it could become pastorally encouraging to say you see these two bodies, Elijah and Moses, and you see Jesus, and that glory is at work in our body now, even as we are wasting away. This is Pauline theology, and I'm reading a book right now by Eve Tibbs on, it's sort of a textbook on Orthodox icons. And it's really quite an amazing book. And the Transfiguration, I read the chapter today about it. And Moses and Elijah are always these icons sort of, the first one determines what all the others can do that try to imitate it. And Moses and Elijah are on the right side and the apostles are on the left. And over the history of iconic representations of the Transfiguration, there are some deep theological moments where Jesus is transfigured. He's transformed. It's a metamorphosis of the body into the glory that will be. And that so Jem, you've got, I think, some rich potential in the pastoral implications of the Transfiguration.
It always amazes me to think that what Peter saw, what they were experiencing when they saw Moses and Elijah, is for Moses, he actually made it into the promised land.
Yeah.
It's also like that part in Star Wars where I know, right? You're not going with me there. Ewok village, he's looking back, he sees. Okay.
The
All right.
Force ghosts? Is that what you're saying?
Well, talking about, when Luke is looking off into the distance and he
Ah.
sees his father, he sees Obi-Wan, right?
Mm.
And they're a little transfigured in their own right. So I don't know that anytime I read this passage in the Bible, that's the moment that comes to mind for me. So I have never used it in a funeral, and now I will
No.
try. Yeah.
Maybe leave the
Yes, and we
Star
need a
Wars
clip. We
reference
we we
off.
need a clip of the Transfiguration Star Wars
Yeah.
clip at a funeral. Yes, that'll be good.
Yeah.
On
If
to our
you're
next question.
king- yeah.
All right. Anne wants to ask, what was an unexpected aha or myth busted by your research about Peter?
Hmm.
Renji's chapter for me probably was maybe the most unexpected direction that someone took. He was doing the chapter on when Peter goes to visit Cornelius. And what Renji does is he actually ties that into the story of Jonah. So
Yeah.
Jonah is, of course, from Joppa, and you have this story of this prophet who doesn't want to go to Nineveh. He doesn't want to go to his enemies. And what Renji does really beautifully is he sees, for whatever reason, Joppa's also mentioned in this story in Acts. And he makes these connections between Peter being a better Jonah, that God is asking him to go visit a man that Peter's Jewish sensibilities would, at a minimum, be irksome to him, but perhaps even hostile toward. And so Renji titled his chapter The End of Us versus Them in this gospel. And you see, and I think what I liked about it is there's this tenderness almost of Peter in this pastoral moment where you realize almost he's having to walk into a home that he would not normally walk into, and he's extending this brotherly baptismal moment of welcome, and then goes on, we know, in the Jerusalem Council and advocates for the full inclusion of Gentiles within the early church. And so I think, though, his chapter tying Peter to Jonah was, I was blown away whenever he first presented that. And so that was a big aha for me.
For me, I think sitting in the classes, I mean, I have to say that you four had my favorite presentations in class because
I
you're
paid
here.
him to say that,
Because you're
guys.
right. Yeah, you're looking straight at us.
That's
I
right.
paid him to
So
say
I have
that.
to say that. But James North,
Mm.
a fellow Pentecostal here, his story about miracles is just something that I hadn't thought of at all when it came to Peter's formation
Yeah.
Mm.
of if you're hanging around with Jesus for 3 years in Galilee, and Jesus is doing all this stuff that the Gospels say, you got to be impressed. But over time, it can even be, oh yeah, just another miracle. We've seen this before. But it formed him into thinking of what God could do in the world. And it gave Peter courage to launch out into Asia Minor as an apostolic Pentecostal preacher of the gospel and church planter. So that was really something for me. And I really liked Matthew McBirth's study of suffering. And how and Matthew is kind of a specialist on First Peter anyway, on Peter experiencing suffering, watching Jesus suffer. I mean, my goodness, what was it like to see Jesus crucified and to say, I could have at least shown more courage. He had courage in the garden and whopped off an ear of somebody, and then immediately he turns into a timid, feeble, whatever you want to call him. He's a fink, and then he gets restored. But Peter suffers, and he knows that suffering is a part of what it means to follow Jesus. So those two chapters I thought were brought out. I think the distinctiveness of this book is that I just hope that those who are in leadership in churches will read the book and think about Peter.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think this would be a great textbook for a pastoral theology class where you have people get together and talk about pastoral experiences.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of experiences at work in Peter's life and in this book. I'm probably talking too much here.
Oh no, I love it.
I think the aha moment for me, do we have time for that, Kelly?
Yeah.
We do. We have 2 other questions to get to, but of
Yeah, yeah,
course we
yeah.
do. What was
No,
your aha moment,
no,
Brenton?
I'll move quick because obviously my chapter focused on the Pentecostal nature of Peter's experience. And so many of the stories that we're talking about come after Pentecost, right? For him, he's bold because of his Pentecostal experience. And so much of just our evangelical understanding of the Pentecostal world is, oh, you're just like you're dialing it up to 11, right? You're taking it beyond where it's supposed to go. Sometimes Pentecostals can get a little crazy. I think I said in the chapter that we're still the kids on the other side of the tracks for a lot of people. We just don't really understand how to deal with Pentecostals. But the storyline from John chapter 20 after the resurrection, where Jesus makes himself known and appears to the disciples and he breathes on them. Do you remember that? And he says, receive the Holy Spirit. And then he encourages them towards forgiveness. And I think the aha surprising moment for me was understanding that actually being empowered by the Spirit for acts of service actually includes things such as forgiveness. And more Christians would be better witnesses towards Jesus if we could actually feel empowered in the Spirit to go forgive a little bit more than we do.
Mm.
It's part of Peter's story. Why wouldn't it be a part of ours?
Good
Mm,
word, Pastor.
yeah.
Very good. Very good.
Next question was by Ian. I really appreciated Taylor's chapter on politics, despite being in the UK where the context is a little different. I was particularly struck by the emphasis on the separation between, quote, public and, quote, political. It's very helpful.
Mm.
Any thoughts on that, Taylor?
Okay. Yeah.
You have been
Okay.
appreciated. You've been
I've been
that
appreciated.
separation that you do between public and political is
Yeah.
helpful. So
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think that's interesting to come
Yeah.
from an observation from someone in the UK where the political context is different, yet the biblical principles are what we're really standing on.
Sure, sure. Yeah, and I think this was a aha moment for me when talking about this with people in my congregation about the political question. We care about politics because we care about the public, because we care about society. And the church is called to go and be the witnesses of Jesus in the public sphere. Peter will say in First Peter to do your good works, do good amongst the pagans, so you shine, right? So this is a perception of public acts and goodness. But what's important to realize, I think, is that we don't simply influence the public through the political. Whenever we're talking about politics, we're talking about the coercive power of the state to set rules for the public to flourish. And that's the hard power mechanism for influencing the public. And it's not the only one or the best one. And so, what I think Peter encourages his people to do is to be involved in public engagement. But especially for them, they had no access to political power. They didn't have any option to get involved in politics, but yet they were to be involved in the public. And I think that's a good lesson for us too. Like we need to be involved in the public sphere. We need to seek the public good. But politics is not the best or only mechanism by which we do that.
It's good, Tay.
That's a good word.
Yeah.
Good.
So good. Nika, the next question is for you. From Jim. Nika, sorry if I misheard you. I think you briefly mentioned that some scholars didn't see Peter stepping out of the boat as helpful. Can you expand on the scholarship that doesn't see Peter stepping out as the right thing to do, and how have you argued against it?
Yeah, Jim, you'll have to buy the book. No, I'm just kidding. In my chapter, there are, especially there was a pastor. The names I'm gonna miss them, so I won't even attempt them. But there was a pastor of a large church in Glasgow, and then some theologians throughout historical theology that really took Peter to task here, that just said, hey, the other disciples had enough sense to stay in the boat, or maybe, and in fact, many said his temperament is the very reason why he jumps out of the boat there. And so, but then there are also voices throughout church history that say that it's his great devotion that leads him to walk out there. He wants to be with Jesus. And so I wanted to present both of those because, again, as somebody who probably would jump out of the boat for better or for worse, I wanted people to see that it wasn't the getting out of the boat that was the failure. It's when he takes his eyes off Jesus and he begins to, like, he experiences the wind and the waves. But yeah, there are several scholars, including some modern ones as well, that really take Peter to task there, and consider this just a wholesale failure on his part. The thing about this story though, what's interesting is Peter, if he's the source behind Mark includes the walking on water, but not Peter, which I think is funny. If like Peter's like talking to Mark and he's like, "Did I tell you about the time I walked on water?" Like it just doesn't make it into the final cut of Mark. But there are plenty of scholars that say Matthew writes with his right hand about Christology and then with his left hand about discipleship. Like he's writing both. He's really trying to show this is what it means to follow Jesus. And I think Peter is actually a really good example of discipleship. And that's what I want to argue in the book is that if we encourage people to not take these risks to follow Jesus, then I don't think that that's a healthy way of viewing discipleship. But when we take these risks and in the middle of them we fail and the sure hand of God saves us, that actually forms us in discipleship. We can take risks with the Lord if we're following him. And when we begin to sink, we can cry out to the only name that has ever saved us. And you'll see in my chapter, the language Matthew uses is the language we see in the Psalter. And so it's really, I think he's making this parallel that's always been Yahweh. It's always been Jesus who saves in these times of peril. But yeah, I felt bad for Pete after a while. I really wanted him to be vindicated in his choice to get out of the boat.
I love that he got out of the boat.
I do too.
I do. I love it. I love that he was just like all in. You know, that with everything he was always all in. Yeah.
A friend of
I'm
Scott.
so jump hopping in the boat. I mean,
it.
get out of the boat. I mean, yeah, absolutely.
A friend of Scott, Rodney Reeves, Scott, in his commentary on Matthew, says we don't know how far he walked. And so it was a fun, imaginative exercise for Rodney because we kind of, I don't know, I know we all have our idea of how far. And he goes, he might have walked 100 yards. I never thought about that. I mean, who knows how many steps he took. And so I like to imagine Pete running around a few times before he begins to sink. You can tell Peter's meant a lot to me now. He's now Pete, just so y'all know. We're on a nickname basis.
Isn't it Matthew? It's an imperfect tense.
The walking, yeah.
Yeah. And I believe I remember reading this when I did my master's thesis. That's the kind of funny things you remember. Is that a lot of people take it as a connotative imperfect that he tried to walk on water. And never even got a step out. So I don't know.
Always like haters, Scott. There's haters everywhere, but poor Pete, you know. He doesn't need I mean, you go 2 more chapters and Peter's being called Satan. So, you know, he's got to take his wins when he can get them. So I'm maybe overly sensitive to him. But I think if you consider the discipleship approach, Matthew's audience is going to face moments of following Jesus being perilous, being difficult, being unsafe. And I think that this story serves that purpose of encouraging people to follow Jesus, even when it is a bit scary. But keep your eyes on him would be the follow-up lesson. So you can take Peter to task for taking his eyes off Jesus, but I think you have to give him credit for getting out of the boat. I mean, when he gets back in, he's going to look at the other 11 and go, "Did you walk on water? No, you did not. So I might be soaking wet, but I walked on water."
After all, it was a pastor who wrote a book. It was a pastor who wrote the book. If you want to walk on water, you got to get out of the boat.
Got to get out of the boat.
Good job,
that's right.
Ortberg.
All right, our next question to Brenton. I would love to hear how or if this changed your personal understanding of being, quote, spirit-filled. I too grew up Pentecostal-ish, and Acts 2 underscored my whole theology. How do you think Peter would define being spirit-filled?
Yeah, that's probably why I took a little bit of liberty and fun with the subtitle of the chapter, Woulda, Coulda, Shoulda Bought a Honda, because in my youth, that was pretty much the litmus test. If you went to youth camp, it was either Thursday night if it was a full week camp, or it's Saturday night if it's a weekend retreat, and you had to have Holy Spirit night. We had to make sure that we counted salvations that week, but also spirit baptisms. And the only way you could really tell that was with, evidence of speaking in tongues. But I think for me, the understanding and how Peter would describe it, it's a little bit more broad than just the speaking in tongues aspect. That's part of it, but there's more going on, right? There's a little bit more. I think for me, when I read about Peter, he has no pedigree other than he's a fisherman, and he faithfully followed Jesus. Whereas you get Paul's got a pedigree, and he's quick to point it out when he needs to, right? Who he studied under. He's of the tribe of Benjamin. His lineage is pure. Peter's the guy who didn't make the cut and go to rabbi school. He ended up out on the water's edge fishing because he had nothing else going for him. And so a Pentecostal theology from Peter's perspective is it can take the every man or every woman and empower them into service, empower them into witness for the gospel, expanding the kingdom, utilizing the gifts of the Spirit, not in weird and crazy, funky ways that perhaps sometimes gets laughed at in our evangelical circles. But it's not lost on me why spirit-empowered people are making the kingdom known all throughout the world in really profound ways. Why is it that our Catholic brothers and sisters are even finding themselves to be filled with the Holy Spirit for acts of witness all across the world? So it's a good thing. Peter's story is helpful for us.
Yeah.
Amen.
Rachel Meyer also gave us an observation in the chat, and that is that her favorite quote in the book is, "There is no failure in following the call of Jesus." This hit home for her, and what a good reminder, especially for a newer pastor and leading in a more deeper way. So if we take that quote, "There's no failure in following the call of Jesus," how can we encourage the people who have joined us on this webinar in the next 4 minutes, whether they're a new pastor or a new Bible teacher or a new Christian, or whether they're experienced in these areas and they're leaning in to learn more, which is why they showed up tonight.
Taylor Terzek will begin.
I
Taylor
think
one or Taylor two.
We're not gonna let Nika start first.
Well,
good.
does Nika
Wow.
know who said that?
I don't.
Since she edited the book, right?
I know. I think it was Alice. would
There is
be
no
my-
Sounds
failure. Yeah.
Sounds like Alice to me.
Yeah, it
does.
sounds like
Yeah,
Alice.
yeah.
I think to contemplate failure in pastoral ministry is really important. I don't know if I felt the space to fail as a pastor.
It's good.
And so I think there's a give and take here. I think pastors maybe can give themselves false expectations of success, but also congregations can give false expectations of success and not give any room for failure. And I think Peter puts out for us a messy, failing, but also redemptive story of following Jesus and being a leader at the same time. So I think his story could provide room for people to see that as a possibility for people's lives.
You know, in the gospel stories about failure, faith failure, alagapostoi is the little faith. Jesus, in a sense, corrects them, rebukes them, and then says, "Keep following me." So I like that line. There's no failure, because Jesus doesn't disown those who fail. He calls them to continue.
Yeah. Nika?
Yeah, that was that word for you of little faith. It doesn't mean no faith, and that's actually one of the points I make in my chapter is when you're rebuked by Jesus, which Peter has the privilege of being that multiple times. Jesus doesn't say no faith; he says little faith, and with that little faith, Jesus continues to shape and mold him. And so I think to Taylor's point, there has to be room for failure for our pastors and in our ministries. But I would also say, maybe to those who would. Who maybe exploit failure and continue on in ministry when perhaps they should step out. I would also say Peter gives us a model of repentance where his failure and his repentance are both on display. And I would say for any pastor who wants to continue after failure, let your repentance, let your confession also be well known.
That's good.
Very true. Yes.
Well said, Nika.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in our final minute, Scott, what are your closing words for us?
Our closing words.
Yes.
I'm not one to offer closing words.
Can I ask a fun question to give you time to think, Scott?
Yeah.
If this will give you some time to think. If you had to cast Peter in a movie, what actor would play him?
Ooh.
Are you asking me?
I'm asking the others while you think of your closing
See,
remarks.
I don't know anything about actors.
Brenton, I'm thinking of you, man, because there's an obvious answer.
Which is what?
There is.
Which is who?
It's Dwayne the Rock Johnson.
Oh, that's true. He is the Rock. I thought you were going to go with Sylvester Stallone as Rocky because that's the OG. But okay,
We'll accept both.
yeah.
All right, I bought you time, Scott.
Okay. The I think what I would say is that Peter needs to become a favorite character in the pages of the New Testament for those who are in leadership in the church.
Mm.
And he needs to become a model of what pastoral life really is.
Yeah.
And Taylor said this right, is that many pastors don't feel they have space to fail. If we are looking at that, we are making claims that wouldn't even be true of the two most famous apostles in the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church, Peter and Paul.
Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
I think it's a mistake. And I really believe that we need to use Peter more frequently in our leadership teachings.
Yeah. It's good.
It's a good word.
Well, Kelly, we have to thank you for organizing this for us.
Yeah. Thank you, Kelly.
Thanks, Kelly.
You know that it would never have been done if you'd have left it up to me. At least we
man,
probably
doesn't
wouldn't
work.
be here. We'd be looking for a link. So I want to thank you for your good work and for your work for us. And Nika, for editing the volume. My name is on it, but everybody knows that you did the hard work. I did read everything carefully
Yeah,
and found.
We make a good
found
team,
mistakes.
Scott.
So, but you did great work on it.
Thank you.
And thank you to all the students who wrote chapters. I think this is a really valuable book for all of us.
Here, here.
Yep. Thanks for
Here.
tonight. Great conversation.
Thank you. So thank you everyone for attending this webinar produced by the Center for Women in Leadership. We hope to be doing more webinars like this in the future. I have it on a plan, and so we're going to get better and better at doing this sort of format because it's fun and allows people to hear conversations between people, and it brings our resources to life because you can see the personalities behind some of the publishers, right? So please look for your newsletter and so that you can see new events that are coming up. So thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Awesome. Thanks, Kel.
Bye.
Beavers winning 47-39 at halftime.
Ooh, big win.